This lecture is on summarizing and quoting, two important ways that you can get at what other people are saying. In fact, when you summarize, you're really using a device to get to your point. That is, you want to place your views before the reader in a way that makes your views sensible. And the best way to do that is to summarize the other historian's points that you will respond to. When you do a summary, whether it's of someone's interpretation or a set of facts, but particularly when you're dealing with their interpretations, you have to give a fair summary. That is, no closet cliches, what you think the other author is saying, but what they're not really saying. And don't engage in any straw man arguments. That is, using the summary or kind of a fake summary of what someone else is saying that allows you to set up a problem that doesn't really exist in that other person's work that you have a mechanism to knock down. That's a lot like a doctor who has a cure looking for a disease that needs curing. So give a fair summary. Actually summarize what's really there before you respond to it. Discuss the parts of that other author's work, or summarize the parts of that other author's work to which you will directly respond. Don't divert or misdirect your reader, and keep your own ideas in mind when summarizing another author's work. This is particularly true of an interpretation. Remember that a summary is a mechanism by which you enter a conversation that your readers know only because you tell them about it. So it's like you're reporting on a conversation that you're having with someone else. When you summarize, use signal verbs to introduce that summary. You can use signal verbs to introduce quotations also. There are signal verbs by which you make a claim or which you introduce a summarization claim. There are verbs that you can use to agree, to disagree, or to make recommendations. You can also use these verbs in your summary, not just to introduce your own concepts, but to tell us what the other author is talking about. They may make a claim, they may make recommendations, they may agree with some third party or disagree with a third party. And you can use these mechanisms and the Grafenberkenstein Chapter 2 templates to introduce summaries. This list of verbs is in Grafenberkenstein's first edition, page 37. It may be in later editions under slightly different page, but it is in the summarization chapter. Now, what about quoting? Quoting, which is Grafenberkenstein's Chapter 3, is a more complex thing than summarization. You can quote under two general circumstances, the same way that you would quote, or excuse me, the same way that you might summarize. And these two circumstances are to directly introduce what another author's interpretation is, or what you're more likely to do until you're comfortable dealing with the historiography and the literature is to make a quotation from another author as though that's some kind of evidence. Now, there are times when that is appropriate. That's certainly appropriate when you are quoting from a primary source. However, quoting from your secondary sources, you should really limit that to quoting their interpretations and then only sparingly. Don't quote just because your secondary source says it better than you can. Of course they say it better than you can. They've had months or years to work on every sentence. That's the essence of publication. They've had people reading those sentences, making suggestions. They've had time in draft after draft after draft over months and months and months to polish that. You've got one term. How can you possibly have time to polish your prose that well? So you're going to be tempted to grab a quote because they say it so well. Well, no one cares. At least no one wants to hear what they have to say. We want to hear what you have to say. So don't quote just because your secondary source says it better than you. Quote sparingly. And when you quote, integrate, introduce, and explain the significance of your quotation. Also, integrate the quotation with your ideas. When you quote, quote relevant passages. You'd be surprised at the number of papers I read that have at least one quotation that only marginally quotes anything that they're talking about in their paper. It's like they know what they're talking about, but I've got no clue why they inserted that quote there. Quote generally only interpretive statements that demonstrate another author's point of view that you intend to engage. Don't just quote stuff. Don't try to quote data. When you quote, frame the quotations. That is, you have to introduce them correctly. You have to tell us who the quote is from, why that person is important, and it can be just a simple phrase, but an author is a ridiculous thing to put in. Duh, you're quoting them out of a book or an article. Of course they're an author. But what kind of author? We have all kinds of authors nowadays, and we've had them for a long period of time. There are experts, there are dolts, people who know nothing. They still write all over the place. That doesn't make them quotable. So tell us who made the quotation, why that person is important to your argument. Also, don't just drop in a hit and run quotation. That is, you have just thrown in a quote as though that's all you have to say. A quotation is really a cat's paw for a point you want to make. It is not a substitute for your words. Then follow up the quotation with an explanation of what that quotation means to your argument. There's another way that you can go about effectively using quotations as well, and that is to blend the quotes with your own words. For example, in Grafton-Berkenstein, compare the passages on page 42 with the passage on page 44 in the first edition. The passage on page 44 is a much better integrated quotation because the author engages components of the quotation. To blend the quoted words with your own, you need a good introduction. I've said that 3 times already, so I must be kind of serious about it. Engage with the different components of the quotation. Explain how the quote is important to your own work. And this simply means you will not quote very frequently. Okay. When you summarize, you restate another author's position. You want to do that fairly, and you want to do it so that you can get your own thoughts sensibly in front of your reader. When you quote, You must limit your quotations. You have to integrate your quotations. You have to make them relevant. You have to frame them correctly. And the best of all possible worlds is to blend your words with the quoted words. Let me say one last thing that's not on a slide. When you quote, you must have both quotation marks and a citation. The quotation marks tell us that the words in between the quotation marks are not your words. They belong to someone else and you're borrowing them. The citation tells us where you got the words from. Leave one out and you're probably guilty of plagiarism. One last thing. With very, very few exceptions, all ending punctuation goes inside the quotation marks, particularly hard stops like periods and exclamation points, whether they're in the quotation or not, or they just end your sentence. They go inside the quotation marks, and commas go inside the quotation marks. And with that, again, thank you very much.